there's a magic that happens when you're responsible for somebody learning something for the first time, and that results in tremendous feelings of self-esteem.
It's wonderful for everybody involved. I mean, here we have our own students teaching our younger students, and it's a role model to look up to.
I think, if we're creative, we can find ways to tap into the ways that students can show us their best learning.
Students bring diverse and interesting stories with them, and my teaching methods allow a space for them to have voice and to improve and deepen the education of everybody in the room.
One more thing that really moved me about it was the way the students really came together.
(1620) Plymouth, Massachusetts. The first European settlers stepped foot in America. Contrary to popular belief, they were not the first settlers. At least 16 others had come before them. But, not to be dissuaded, they would soon call this place the New Land, and soon they would meet the inhabitants of this so-called New Land, the natives, or as they called them, the Indians. At least 40 million lived throughout the Western Hemisphere. It is believed that the first native tribe that the new white settlers met were the Wampanoag. They had lived at Plymouth for at least 10,000 years before the white settlers had stepped foot. But I'm fairly certain you know that the English settlers were not the first white settlers to be near America, for we all know the tale of Christopher Columbus. The Columbian Exchange began shortly after Christopher Columbus stepped foot in the Caribbeans in 1492. It was a way to bring New World crops to the Old World, and vice versa. It would be referred to as a swap of people, plants, animals, and diseases. The New World introduced potato, tobacco, corn, tomato, cocoa bean, and various fruits and vegetables to the Old World. But even more important than these various crops were the plants that were acquired. Sunflower, petunia, black-eyed Susan, dahlia, marigold, zinnia, poinsettia, all brought over from the New World to the Old. The New World also introduced turkey. Because of the demand for New World crops, many of the tropical regions of America, in particular the Caribbeans, were transformed quickly into massive plantations, used particularly to grow sugarcane, a very popular export from the new land. This was in spite of, or rather because of, sugarcane's original origin being from the Old World. The New World was just being seen as a money-making tool. Many of the native workers who were being used to tend for the sugarcane died as a result of the grueling work. It is estimated by historians that each ton of sugar cost one worker's life. This depleting workforce caused the white settlers to decide to bring in African slaves, beginning the cycle of slavery that would combust into the Civil War we all know. Even more profitable was tobacco. Despite the king's objections, tobacco became huge in Europe, and the New World had to provide. Ironically, the white settlers first learned of this money-making crop by noticing natives smoking tobacco from either primitive cigars or pipes, the white settlers would soon adopt this habit. The differences between the New World and the Old World were staggering. Only buildings, housing, infant mortality, and life expectancy were the only similarities between pre-colonial America and England. Arguably the most important import from England were horses! Horses, or as they were referred to by the Aztecs, sky dogs, brought over by the British in the 1600s, right as they came to the New World. By the end of the 1600s, the Apaches and the Comanches were using Mustangs to go north of Rio Grande. The horses helped tribes move westward so that they could go and hunt buffalo. Massive change from the small game and nuts that they had been used to for these many years. But easily the biggest item that the British had brought over was disease. Of course, disease had existed before Columbus-era colonialization. The natives had suffered through tuberculosis, parasitism, and dysentery. However, the arrival of Columbus and then the white settlers brought new, even more fun diseases to the New World, including smallpox, measles, diphtheria. The native communities lost 50 to 90% of their people from these diseases. Diseases that, back in the Old World, would be seen as nothing more but childhood illnesses. Most native communities who caught these diseases had never even come in contact with the white settlers. Disease spread was not one-sided, however. After Columbus and his men returned to Spain, his team had ended up spreading syphilis all throughout Europe, resulting in a long, grueling 5-year epidemic. In the early days, the colonizers had to rely on the natives for food. Powhatan, leader of the Confederation of Tribes around the Chesapeake Bay, used these foods as peace offerings, ways to keep himself on the good side of these new white settlers. The colonizers, who had neglected to grow or bring any food to this new place, were desperate for food to keep themselves energized for the instant wealth that they thought would be present. The man who kept this good grace period going was a man named John Smith. Despite his positive connection with these natives, he believed that they should eventually be treated and compelled to, quote-unquote, drudgery, work, and slavery. This attitude persisted throughout the colonizers, and as a result, fighting happened. Natives would attack settlers, kill livestock, and burn English crops. The English burned villages and corn crops, despite the fact that they were relying on these food sources to survive, which is really, really contradictory. Fucking white people, man. This fighting would bleed over into full-blown wars. The Beaver Wars between the Iroquois and the French and Algonquins lasted from 1609 to 1701. Heavy casualties, full number unknown. The Anglo-Powhatan Wars between the English colonialists and the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia lasted from 1610 to 1614, 1622 to 1632, 1644 to 1646. The Pequot War between the Pequot tribe from Connecticut and the Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut colonialists lasted 1636 to 1638. Approximately 700 either killed or taken into captivity. The War of 1812. The Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seneca tribes fought for the U.S. and the Tecumseh Confederacy. The Shawnees, Iroquois, Ottawa, and countless others fought with the British. 10,000 dead for all causes. Native, of course. With all of these now captured natives was slave labor. At least 2 to 4 million natives were forced into slavery between 1670 and 1715. The most extreme case was the Pequots. After losing their war, they were enslaved, they were sent to the Caribbean upon being defeated. The Trail of Tears came as a result of this forced enslavement. The Trail of Tears came as a result of the Indian Removal Act, signed into law on May 28, 1830, by then United States President Andrew Jackson. The law allowed the president to negotiate with native tribes for their removal to federal territory west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, as well as their African slaves, were forced to walk from their homelands in the southeastern United States to areas west of the Mississippi River that had been designated as Indian Territory. Approximately 2,500 to 6,000 natives died along the Trail of Tears. It is now often considered a genocide.
Hello everyone, I'm Rosalie. Sitting next to me is one of the most influential people in American history. I've revived him from the dead for this project. For our viewers at home who don't know you, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is John Marshall.
Could you give me a basic explanation of your life?
Well, I was born on September 24th, 1755 in Virginia. In 1780, I started my own law practice, defending clients against British creditors. From 1782 to 1795, I held various political offices, including the position of Secretary of State in 1800. In 1801, I became Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, serving until my death on July 6, 1835, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Do you remember presiding over the case of Marbury versus Madison?
Of course.
Mind if I ask you a couple questions?
Why not?
First things first. Why did this case even happen?
Why, the Judiciary Act of 1801, of course. It was passed in the last days of John Adams' administration, 1797 to 1801, and it reorganized the federal judiciary and established the First Circuit judges of the country. The act and the ensuing last-minute appointment of new judges, or the Midnight Judges, annoyed the incoming president, Thomas Jefferson. Ever heard of him?
Yeah.
Great. Well, the judges were selected largely as Federalists like Adams in an attempt to maintain a Federalist presence in the government. Jefferson was not. The whole situation was basically an attempt by Adams and his allies to retain their party's control of the judiciary by stacking it with their supporters. At the end of John Adams' term as president, several commissions were issued naming the Midnight Judges. Most of them were successful. However, some were written but not delivered. The Secretary of State, Madison, failed to deliver the commission to 3 new justices before Adams' term of office ended. One of the commissions was to go to William Marbury.
Oh, so that's why Marbury sued Madison, in an attempt to regain his post. He wanted the court to issue an order facing Madison to give him his commission.
That's correct. The Judiciary Act of 1789 had given the Supreme Court the power to issue such an order, or the writ of mandamus. But that's enough background. Let's take a look at this case, shall we?
My commission was not delivered to me by the time Jefferson was in office. I was chosen for the position by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. I deserve this position, and you, as Secretary of State, should have given my commission to me.
Sorry, bub, but an order's an order. Alright? Face it, you were only chosen because you stacked the deck against Jefferson.
This is just plain ridiculous and unfair. Let's hear what the court decides.
Okay, so basically, your refusal to deliver the commission was illegal, but we don't have the power to order you to hand over Marbury's commission via writ of mandamus. The provision of the Judiciary Act of 1789 enabling you to bring your claim to the Supreme Court was itself unconstitutional, since it extends the court's original jurisdiction beyond that which Article 3, Section 2 established.
Wait, what?
Congress does not have the power to pass laws that override the Constitution, such as by expanding the scope of the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. Thus, we cannot force Jefferson and Madison to appoint Marbury, because we do not have the power to do so. This act of Congress was, simply put, unconstitutional.
Good afternoon, Rosalie. My name is Alex Hernandez. I'm a judge of the Superior Court for the state of Connecticut, and I'm assigned to the Fairfield Judicial District. Okay, I started working in this courthouse about a month ago. I'm in what's called Part A. It's the criminal trial docket for serious felony cases, murders, assaults, arson, for example. Yeah.
What made you decide to become a judge?
Well, it was a good time in my career to do that. I started practicing law in 1986 as a state prosecutor at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and I was there for about 4.5 years before I applied for and got a job working at the U.S. Attorney's Office as a federal prosecutor here in Connecticut. I did that for about 17 years, and then I was in private practice at the law firm of Pullman and Comley here in Connecticut for about 7 years. So I put in my name for consideration, and I was lucky enough to get the attention of Governor Dannel Malloy, and he appointed me to the Connecticut Superior Court.
Are you familiar with the case of Marbury versus Madison?
I most certainly am. It was a case that was taught to us in constitutional law in law school.
What stands out to you about this case?
All right. When you first emailed me about wanting to discuss that case, the first thought that crossed my mind was, I don't deal in issues like that, like federal questions of constitutionality and this and that and the other. The case is very interesting, and I'll get back because it actually is a very good question, and I'm glad that you're studying it. The case involved an application for a writ of mandamus, which is basically a fancy way of saying a court order, ordering one government official to do something that they're supposed to do. And it was brought by a fellow by the name of Marbury, who had been appointed to a federal circuit court judge right after, was it John Adams? John Adams had just lost the presidency. Thomas Jefferson was coming in. And so the commission had been signed, but it had not been delivered. It was sitting in a mail bag with Mr. Madison. And Mr. Madison refused to deliver his commission to Mr. Marbury, who wanted his judgeship. So Marbury brought, again, this application for a writ of mandamus, an application for a court order to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Justice Marshall's decision had three basic parts to it. First, he recognized that Mr. Marbury had a right to receive his commission to be a circuit court judge. He also found that Madison should deliver it. He was required to deliver it. But then in a very interesting move of jujitsu, Judge Marshall found that the law that gave the Supreme Court authority to hear that case was itself unconstitutional. He found that that law, the Judiciary Judiciary Act of 1789 conferred powers on the Supreme Court that were greater, that is broader. It gave the Supreme Court more authority than what was established in the Constitution. The Constitution gave the United States Supreme Court what's called original jurisdiction, meaning those types of cases went directly to the Supreme Court over two types of cases. Disputes between states. If New York was suing New Jersey for a boundary line, those cases go directly to the Supreme Court. And the other involved disputes involving foreign dignitaries. And I don't know if there's ever been a case brought under that, and I don't know what that means. But the important thing is that Justice Marshall found that the Judiciary Act of 1789 conferred more authority than the Constitution, and therefore that law was unconstitutional. It was a very fraught and difficult political situation that he was in, and he managed to strike exactly the right course. So I thought, those are all very rarefied and faraway, complex issues. It reminds me of the story of three fish. Two young fish come across an older fish, and the older fish says, "How's the water today, boys?" And the younger fish swim away. And one of them says to the other one, "What's water?" The fish are in it every day. They don't even think about it. But it's very real, and they need it to sustain their very existence. Well, when you first asked me to think about Marbury versus Madison, I thought, what does that have to do with what I do? I don't deal with appellate decisions. I just try cases on a regular basis. To me, as a state trial court judge, the importance of Marbury versus Madison is the independence of the judiciary. Nobody in this state can order me to decide a case in a particular way. No one can order me to impose a particular, unless there's a statutory provision that says that the sentence has to be thus and such. I have to follow the law and exercise my discretion within the confines of the law. So one of the most important phrases in that decision is that it is exclusively the province of the courts, in that case the U.S. Supreme Court, to state what the law is, to interpret the law. And so as a judge, I have to follow the law, but I enjoy the benefit of judicial independence. I get to exercise my own conscience in deciding what is right in a given case. Well, sure. I mean, throughout my legal career, focusing primarily on criminal law, I've had to deal with constitutional issues on things like Fourth Amendment questions, whether evidence was lawfully seized. That would be, a Fourth Amendment issue. So I've litigated lots of cases involving, police stop and frisks and the recovery of guns, contraband, you name it. Also, I've had to litigate cases involving confessions or statements that people made to law enforcement officers, and that implicates the Fifth and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution, the Fifth being the right to remain silent, and the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. So, my practice deals with those constitutional issues on a regular basis.
Thank you for your time.
My pleasure, Rosalie. I wish you the best of luck. My regards to Jim DaCosta.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This case established the right of the court system to review acts passed by other branches for constitutionality. Judicial review and the power that comes from it made the judicial branch more equal to the other two branches of government, executive and legislative.
So, how many national laws have been shot down by Supreme Court since, the case of Marbury versus Madison?
About 200.
Wow. That's crazy. All right, well, nice chat, but I should probably get back to my grave now.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Weakest part of the current legal system. Wow, that's a big question. I don't know if I've thought about that enough to give you a really thoughtful question. But if you give me time to think about it, you could always call back and see if I have an answer for that. I'm not sure that I have an answer for that, but no, probably no. I will give you an answer for that. Probably the biggest problem right now is access to the courts by people who don't have the financial resources to get justice. Attorneys are very expensive. Trying cases is very expensive. There's not everyone can afford to hire an attorney to bring a civil suit or money to hire a criminal defense attorney to represent them in a criminal case. So that's probably, that'll be my answer. What is access to the courts? That's my answer.
The year is 1947, and the U.S. government has arrived in Tinseltown. For what purpose, you might be asking? To find them commies.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist.
The House Un-American Activity Communities, or as I will be referring to it now, HWAC, have been trying to find communists in America since 1938, with Martin Dees as its original chairman. Was to conduct investigations into alleged communist and or subversive actors and or organizations infiltrating the United States. 1947 was exactly Hollywood's first interaction with the HWAC. In 1941, Senators Burton Wheeler and Gerald Nye began investigating alleged communist influence in Soviet propaganda in Hollywood. However, lawyer Wendell Willkie defended the studios against allegations, especially as he revealed Wheeler and Nye's conflation of Judaism and communism, especially when it came to discussing the often Jewish leadership of Hollywood studios. However, this victory would soon be short-lived, because this time, the HWAC didn't back down. They continued to fight, and its closest ally, Senator Joseph McCartney, would soon pit ally against ally, friend against friend, worker against worker, in their never-ending quest to remove any subversive actors in their beloved US of A. Some would agree to testify, to give up names, to betray their friends, and those who refused found their way into the infamous Hollywood blacklist. In order to discuss that, we have to discuss, firstly, Joseph McCartney himself. Before he became Hwack's closest ally, he was merely a first-term senator from Wisconsin. He already appeared to be a rather dubious man. He only won because he criticized his opponent, Howard McCurry, for failing to enlist during World War II, and used his own wartime achievements against him. By 1950, he was a prominent member of the U.S. Senate, and was arguably their most outspoken. And though he himself was never a part of Hwack, he was arguably the anti-communist movement's most famous face. It's why the term McCarthyism is linked back to him. But how exactly did so many people in the US, especially those in Hollywood, get accused of being communist or being communist sympathizers? The Great Depression! Contrary to what you might think, Hollywood did fine during the Depression, mostly because it was the only form of disposable entertainment that people could afford. It also helped that they cut wages so that their executives can get more money. Don't let anyone know, though. But while the studios did fine, the average Hollywood contractor did not. A lack of faith in the failing US economy, this was pre-New Deal by the way, plus a rise in fascism in Europe, you know, your Nazis, your Mussolinis, you know, the big guys. It made many people in America, especially immigrants who had fled those places, weary of America's future. And it made people consider various other political and social identities. Many would choose communism. Some would choose similar ideological systems, Marxism and socialism, but communism was the big one. However, most communists were not looking for violent revolution and overthrowing the government. They were mostly just concerned with domestic issues. Racial inequality, class struggles, the family economy, etc., etc. Not exactly people you need to put on a watch list. Thus, the Communist Party of the United States of America, or CAPUZA, as I will refer to it from now, was formed. Until the mid-50s, it would be the most popular leftist organization in America, with membership peaking at 85,000 in 1942. Just as America entered World War II. At this point, while there weren't many Hollywood workers attending these meetings, they gave the most money. Stanley Lawrence, arguably CAPUZA's most important recruiter, referred to these Hollywood workers as fat cows to be milked. Now Martin Dees, the then chairman of Hwack, got word of these evil leftists destroying his good old America with their movies, and tried to do himself an expose. Using tips from fed-up Hollywood workers who were tired of dealing with all these leftists and commies, he began investigating Hollywood to somehow combat the leftist New Deal. Because you couldn't be a conservative if you didn't like FDR. He would then accuse 42 or 43, depending on who you ask, members of the quote-unquote Hollywood film colony of either being full-blown members of the Communist Party or fellow sympathizers and active followers. However, he concluded, ironically, that there was no threats to good old American values. Because there isn't. This discovery, quote unquote, happened concurrently around Pearl Harbor. And at that rate, World War II became everything that America revolved itself around. All forms of communist investigating was thrown out the window in order to get to Tinseltown's good side. And hilariously, there was sudden praise for communism, especially our now ally, Soviet Union. Especially Joseph Stalin. At this rate, many films began to put in communist values and or sympathy with communist Russia. Films like Mission to Moscow, which despite bombing horribly with critics, was quite successful in helping people both relate to and sympathize with Russian communists, particularly its citizens. Other films included Crossfire, whose trailer was so adamant with how important this film was.
Ladies and gentlemen of the motion picture going public, I want to tell you about a film we've just completed called Crossfire, which will be in this theater very soon. On February 13th, 1947, the final script of Crossfire was mimeographed and distributed to executives and department heads. At this time, a date for start of production is usually set up, but in the case of Crossfire, final decision was postponed. This script dealt with a subject that alarmed some people at the studio, and memos crossed my desk, which ran something like this.
Are you sure the public will want to see this?
It's a terrific story, but should we lead with our chins?
Well, this is very outspoken, but have we got enough nerve to make it?
Are you sure audiences will buy this kind of entertainment?
And the rather infamous Tender Comrade. Tender Comrade was written by Dalton Trumbo, a rather famed writer who was also a communist with super far left political leanings. However, its star, Ginger Rogers, was arguably Hollywood's most famous Republican and arguably its most conservative star. And she did not feel comfortable with the dialogue she was given, which she interpreted as being communist. Her mother, Layla Emerdine, would testify on her daughter's behalf and use the film to defame Trumbo. Many political conservatives in Hollywood would create the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. The Motion Picture Alliance attempted to defend the film industry, and by proxy the government, from communism and fascism, because those are totally the same things. Nothing different at all. Many of Hollywood's most famous conservatives would be a part of this, including John Wayne, Walt Disney, Barbara Stanwyck, Ginger Rogers, Cecil B. DeMille, Victor Fleming, Ayn Rand, then actor Ronald Reagan, and John Ford. At this rate, anyone with membership, quote unquote, alleged membership, or even mere sympathy with the Communist Party of the US of A, and or refused to testify against supposed communists, was immediately blacklisted. Being blacklisted meant that you were unable to find any work in any industry that you worked in. And this campaign extended far beyond Hollywood. Pretty much every industry was affected by this. But Hollywood had it the worst. Hundreds upon hundreds of actors, writers, directors, producers, and studio heads were subpoenaed by WHAC. But of all those subpoenaed, 10 of them refused outright to say anything. They would become the poster children for the Hollywood blacklist. The Hollywood 10. Those 10 were Alvin Besby, Herbert Biberman, Lester Cole, Edward Meitrick, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, and the aforementioned Trumbo. All of them spent at least some time in prison for contempt of Congress as a result to refusing to answer any questions. Originally, this group also included writer and playwright Bertolt Brecht, but he fled the country after his inquest, leaving only these 10 to be fined and imprisoned. Of all the 10, only one decided to testify afterward. Meitrick agreed to cooperate, revealing to himself to have been a communist, and gave at least 26 names to whack. Outside of those 10, many notable names testified. Paul Robeson, actor, singer, and political activist. He refused to recant his quote-unquote subversive views on the civil rights cause.
The great poet of Russia is of African blood.
Let us not go so
It is
far
important to
afield.
explain this.
Did you make that statement?
When I first went to Russia in 1934...
Did you make that
When I
statement?
first went to Russia in
Did you
1934...
make that statement?
In Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi. No color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being. But I do not feel the pressure of color as I feel it in this committee today.
Why do you not stay in Russia?
Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?
You are here because you are promoting the communist cause.
I am here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees.
He lost his right to travel for years. Ronald Reagan, then actor and also one of Hollywood's most noted Republicans, stated that
we have done a pretty good job in our business of keeping those people's activities curtailed. We have, after all, we must legally recognize them at the present as a political party. On that basis, we have exposed their lies when we came across them. We have been eminently successful in preventing them from their usual tactic of trying to run a majority of an organization with a well-organized minority.
Walt Disney felt that his company was most vulnerable to the quote-unquote Red Menace, as they were responsible for a strike at his studio a while earlier. Elia Kazan, arguably the poster child for those who testified, a famed stage director who had just recently moved into making films. He was briefly a communist in the 30s, but felt that it was his patriotic duty to testify against all those evil subversive communists. He named 8 former colleagues in a former leftist theater trope. Arguably the most ridiculous example of testifying would be Martin Berkeley, screenwriter of the film Tarantula.
A blunder that transformed a tiny insect into the 100-foot spider that was now ravaging the panic-stricken countryside.
He would name 161 names, and it got to a point that the head investigator told Berkeley that he was giving them more names than was needed. Testifying would go on for years on end, officially ending sometime in the mid to late 50s. During that time, Hollywood began to produce many anti-communist and anti-Soviet propaganda films, such as The Red Menace, The Red Debut, Red Planet Mars. Arguably my favorite example of these types of films, I Was a Communist for the FBI, which I think hilariously was nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the 1951 Academy Awards. The aftermath of the WHAC hearings in Hollywood were detrimental to almost everyone, even if it was only for a short time. McCarthy began to attack anyone and everyone after these investigations began to end. He would attack President Eisenhower and other Republican and Democratic leaders for allegedly having subversive ties, and he would deem anything that wasn't overtly Christian and pro-American as being immoral, communistic atheism. It got to such a ridiculous degree that a televised 36-day hearing on alleged charges of subversion in the U.S. military would prompt Army lawyer Joseph Nye Welch to famously say,
"Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?"
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
I'll say it
may
hurts.
I say, Mr. Chairman, as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to finish this.
Senator, I think it hurts you too, sir.
I'd like to finish this.
That, mixed with a televised special by Edward R. Murrow that used McCartney's own words against him and publicly criticized him for his blatant fear-mongering, led public opinion against him. Republicans would lose control of the Senate, and he would be one of the few senators to be censored by the U.S. Senate. The Hollywood 10, with the exception of Metrick, would have difficulty finding any work. With the exception of Trumbo and Lardner, Trumbo would find much success during the period in which he was blacklisted. He secretly wrote Roman Holiday, which won an Academy Award, but because he was still on the blacklist, a front writer, Ian McClellan Hunter, was named writer instead. By 1960, he was blatantly credited for his work on Exodus and Spartacus. These films' admission that they were written by a blacklisted writer helped spend the end of the Hollywood blacklist. Lardner would win Best Original Screenplay for his script for MASH, a film directed by noted leftist Robert Altman, who, if he had directed films just a few decades later, would probably have been blacklisted himself. There were many more prominent victims of the Hollywood blacklist. Orson Welles, Lena Horne, Charlie Chaplin, Lee Grant. As you could imagine, the careers of those who did testify against people, all good. Walt Disney state-made movies. Elia Kazan would win Best Director and Best Picture for his film On the Waterfront, a film that many have described as a thinly veiled defense on himself testifying, though also considered one of the greatest films ever. Martin Berkeley would go back to return to writing schlocky, garbage B movies, and Ronald Reagan became President Reagan. The WHAC would lose its prestige and respect as the 50s rolled into the 60s, and by 1975, it was officially terminated and abandoned. But the linger of the WHAC would not be just with any one person or organization. It was the two things that it was revolved around: conservatism, and communism. In the 50s, communism was demonized. Propaganda films everywhere, whether from Hollywood or short little industrial films, would make communism out to be a treacherous, un-American act. If you know a communist, it was your American duty to report them.
New world is dying, Dad, and it's burying itself in the dry rot of imperialism and colonialism. Communism is building a new world right in front of your eyes, and you can't see it.
I saw communism at work before you were born, Paul. I remember the horrible senseless violence, the bitterness. I saw the terror in Kiel and Berlin.
Conservatism grew in the 50s as well. Few people would even dare to criticize the government or its actions for fear of being labeled a communist or a sympathizer. Fears of a communist or far-left government takeover became commonplace. And it's a shame, really, because any form of leftist beliefs, whether they be communism, socialism, Marxism, or even liberalism, have become distrusted and hated. And it all comes back to a government too afraid to hear anyone with a different opinion in an alleged free state. Whack, McCarthy, and anyone who gave up names distorted the image of what America should be. In an attempt to preserve the dream that they held so dear, they merely warped it beyond recognition.
Mr. McCarthy, I will not discuss this further with you. You have sat within 6 feet of me and could have asked me about Fred Fisher. You have seen fit to bring it out, and if there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. I will not discuss it further. I will not ask Mr. Cohn any more witnesses. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, call the next witness.